300 years ago, and one day, Robert Walpole accepted the roles of First Lord of the Treasury, Chancellor of the Exchequer, and Leader of the House of Commons. The de facto concentration of power in the hands of one figure, and a figure in the increasingly important House of Commons, has led historians to retroactively date this moment as the creation of the role of Prime Minister, though the term was not used in any official capacity until the late 19th century. As well as being the first, Walpole is also noted for being the longest-lasting, serving just shy of 21 years continuously in the role. Robert Walpole was born in Norfolk in 1676, the son of Robert Walpole, a Whig MP and minor magnate who represented the constituency of Castle Rising in the House of Commons from the Glorious Revolution of 1688 to his death in 1700. The younger Walpole succeeded his father to his seat in January 1701, before transplanting to the seat of King's Lynn in 1702, a seat he would hold as MP, with a brief break. For the next 40 years, Walpole made his ministerial career during the coalition government of Lord Godolphin, and the Whigs ruled under Queen Anne's. In 1708, Walpole found a position in Prince George's household, Queen Anne's spouse. Walpole used this position to bring about reconciliation on important matters between the Whig MPs and the Tory government. In 1708, again despite being a Whig, he became Secretary of War, and between 1710–11 he briefly held the position of Treasurer of the Navy. Walpole did not long survive the 1710 general election, which, against the backdrop of the Exchequer riots, resulted in a Tory landslide and Robert Harley replacing Godolphin as leader of the government. As was common then, and may becoming common in the present United States, Walpole was impeached for his conduct in office after resigning, and after being found guilty by a Tory Parliament, he was imprisoned in the House of Lords for 6 months and expelled as MP, though he was eventually released and re-elected as MP for King's Lynn. The death of Queen Anne, and the accession of George I, created opportunities for the Whigs. George I disliked the Tories for signing the Treaty of Utrecht, in which Britain abandoned her allies, including the electorate of Hanover, to make peace with the French. George I also suspected many of Jacobitism, and so not only did he refuse to allow any Tories in his cabinet, but he also systematically removed them from local government positions under his patronage. This created a 45-year period known as the Whig Supremacy 1714 to 1760, and within this Whig supremacy, Walpole and his successors were to be the dominant force until the accession of George III. In George I's first government, Walpole served as paymaster of the forces, 1714–5, as well as the chair of a committee to prosecute figures in Lord Harley's administration, before ascending to Chancellor of the Exchequer and First Lord of the Treasury. His tenure in office between 1715 and 1717 in these positions does not mark him as a prime minister, in part because he was still under the thumb of more powerful figures in the government, such as James Stanhope, the Earl of Sunderland, and Walpole's brother-in-law Viscount Townshend. All of these figures individually reported to the king, and their power and influence were very much dependent on their relationship with George I, not any codified constitutional settlement or division of responsibilities as one may expect from a modern government. One of Walpole's achievements during his brief first period at the helm of British finance was the creation of a sinking fund to pay off the immense debt brought on the government by the 9 Years' War, 1689 to 1697, and the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1713. In 1717, a period known as the Whig Split was initiated by Walpole and Townshend, who refused to accept the foreign policy of George I and Stanhope, with an insistence on an active stance in Baltic politics. The electorate of Hanover was involved in the Great Northern War, 1700 to 1721, on the Russian side, and George expected support from British ministers in this conflict. Stanhope's vision of a Britain engaged in Baltic politics was thus one more amenable to George I than Walpole's vision of peace and economy. Walpole resigned his offices in 1717 and went into opposition. Walpole's brief career as an opposition MP involved an unlikely alliance with the Tories, and a visceral criticism of his former allies on everything from foreign policy, peerages, as well as the scheme for the South Sea Company to engraft the government's national debt. Walpole defeating the Peerage Bill of 1719 in the Commons demonstrated his indispensability to the government, and the slow process of reconciliation began. The 1720-21 period was crucial for Walpole in several respects. Firstly, the South Sea Bubble, before it burst, created an atmosphere of prosperity and optimism that induced him to abandon opposition tactics for a government position. Another factor was the Treaty of Stockholm, 1719, by which Hanover gained the territory of Bremen-Verden from Sweden and thus exited the Great Northern War. A peaceful Hanover would thus reduce the demands George I would place on his ministers. Finally, Walpole was able to effect a reconciliation between the Prince of Wales, the future George II, and the King in the spring of 1720 that bought him favor at the court. Thus, both from Walpole's perspective and that of the King, the reasons for antipathy were superseded by later developments. In June 1720, Walpole was reappointed Paymaster of the Forces. Just a few weeks into his new job, the value of South Sea stock reached an all-time high of £1,050 a share. Earlier in the year, the company had taken on £31 million of government debts, agreeing to compensate the holders of government annuities the value of their holdings in South Sea stock. The rising price of the stock quickly made such a bargain beneficial for both sides. However, South Sea Company did not actually do very much. Renewed war with Spain, 1718 to 1720, meant that the trade with South America granted by the 1713 Asiento was negligible and, aside from engrafting the government's debt, it was not clear to everyone what the South Sea Company did that made it worth £1,050 a share. Some figures, like Daniel Defoe, thought that the financial scheme alone would make the company profitable, and thus justify a higher share price by which the government's debts could be successfully engrafted. However, others, like Robert Walpole, saw through the scheme as likely to lead to disaster. It should be noted that Walpole's political hostility to the scheme in early 1720 did not prevent him from buying low and selling high, making a huge personal profit, which allowed him to renovate his home in Houghton, Norfolk. The South Sea Bubble popped in 1720. The value of the stock plummeted from £1,050 in July to £170 in October. Thousands were ruined, and the political class, from Chancellor, a Sibyl who had advocated for the engraftment, to the King himself who was the honorary governor of the South Sea Company and had a substantial personal position in the company, were discredited. Fears of the entire Hanoverian dynasty collapsing were exacerbated by the King's absence in Hanover until October 1720. Having opposed the scheme from the start, Walpole was the only credible figure to whom the King could turn for financial advice. And so on April 3rd, sorry this post is late, Walpole was appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer, First Lord of the Treasury, and the House of Commons leader. To what extent was Walpole the dominant figure in 1721? It did help that two of his main rivals, Stanhope and Sunderland, both died in 1721 February. He had to share power with his brother-in-law, Viscount Townshend, who was Secretary of State for the Northern Department from 1721 to 1730. The first 9 years of Walpole's government is sometimes referred to as the Walpole-Townshend Ministry. The Lord Carteret was also in the Southern Department until 1724, and King George I did not forget Walpole's oppositional posturing during 1717 to 1720, and when George II acceded in 1727 it was thought initially he would replace Walpole. All of these points underlie the extent to which Walpole's power was seen as transitory in 1721, and it was by no means inevitable that he would remain in office in 20 years, or construct a prime ministerial system of government from which we count his period in office. Finally, though Walpole came to emerge, in part through longevity, as the dominant figure in his government, this is not obviously the case for every ministry after him. Walpole is thought to have been succeeded as Prime Minister by the Earl of Wilmington, who, while being First Lord of the Treasury, was a weak player in a cabinet also featuring Carteret, Pelham, Newcastle, and Gower. The ministry in charge of Britain during the 7 Years' War is often called the Pitt-Newcastle Ministry, recognizing that while Newcastle is given the historical designation of Prime Minister for this conflict, Pitt the Elder was in charge of much strategic planning and was as essential to carrying government motions through the Commons as Newcastle was in the Lords. It was not until the 19th century, with, for example, Benjamin Disraeli's signature on the 1878 Treaty of Berlin as Prime Minister of Britain, that the title held any formal weight, and with Britain not having a codified constitution, it does not have any enshrined status beyond what can be found in late 19th or early 20th century statute.